Do you not think you're being too optimistic about Ukraine? It can do all this, but Russia can't do anything? Like, Russia has taken Pokrovsk effectively, right? Isn't that a big deal?
Not really. I mean, Russia took Bakhmut. The media focused on that for a long time. Russia lost hundreds of thousands of people. They finally took the city, and then it took them a long time to take Avdiivka. And then after they took Avdiivka, they've been sitting outside Pokrovsk for a long time. It took them a long time, and they haven't taken Pokrovsk. But, the media has been telling us for months that they have. Eventually, they probably will. But, that tells you something in and of itself. The media, rather than being too optimistic about Ukraine, what they do is they prophesy the loss of a Ukrainian city, and it actually takes like a month to years longer than the media thinks it will. And so, no, I don't think I'm being too optimistic. What happens if Russia takes Pokrovsk? From a practical level, of course, it's a loss. But Ukraine has many of their larger fortress cities behind that line.
This is The Global Gambit.
Welcome back, everyone. This is a part 2 conversation with Paul Warburg, host of the, Paul Warburg Geopolitical channel and also the Icarus Project, and someone who we've had on before. Part 1, we discussed the Sino-Russian relationship. We covered its dynamics to India, to America. Could China try to annex parts of Russia? Check that out in part 1. But part 2, I wanted to obviously focus more on the Ukraine war specifically, something we cover especially a particular amount we focus on the channel because of its gravitas. But Paul, you focus on things from a perhaps slightly different angle. You don't just approach the same what's being covered in mainstream media. But that being said, a lot has been happening. And when you are taking a step back and trying to make sense of all these different moving parts, where is your head at? What do you think about the dynamics of the peace plan, about Europe's attempts, about Ukraine itself right now?
Yeah, well, I'll just be blunt. The peace plan is going nowhere. And that's not a surprise to me. And
Really?
It's not a surprise, I think.
Paul, you shocked me.
Yeah, exactly. It's not a surprise to anybody who's been paying attention. I have no idea why this same exact peace plan was brought forward again. I have my theories. They're just speculation. Nobody really knows except for Trump and the people in his administration who are pursuing it. But obviously, the peace plan was originally proposed with a lot of gravitas, and you have to agree by Thanksgiving here in the United States, which was towards the end of November, or else you will risk losing aid. That got a lot of blowback, and the Trump administration backed down from those points. And then, surprise, surprise, we're basically back to where we were before. And my honest personal opinion is I don't know why there's so much media hoopla about this. Maybe it's just because they don't have anything else to talk about. But there's no real progress on a peace plan. That hasn't been going on throughout the entire war. The basic positions of each side remain the same, and they're not willing to cave. Ukraine is not willing to cede territory to Russia, particularly territory that Russia hasn't captured yet. And they still obviously militarily believe that they're capable of defending that territory. And Russia is still not willing to quit, I think probably mostly because of the personal psychology of Vladimir Putin. There's a lot of other historical figures that we could compare him to, whether that be Gaddafi or Mussolini or Hitler himself, who have had this exact same psychology, who really thought that they were going to win because that's what was necessary for their own survival. And I think that's kind of where Putin is now personally. Whatever the reason, Russia's still not willing to back down. And so, while everybody wants peace, obviously Vladimir Putin doesn't, and he doesn't want peace on terms that are acceptable to Ukraine, who's defending themselves for a reason. So I think the status quo is going to continue for some time, unfortunately, until if it were to be accelerated, it would be because the United States finally figures it out, gets its act together, and realizes that they're not going to change reality just by making media headlines.
Yeah, no, I agree. To be honest, my thoughts were exactly the same. Why is there this amount of attention? Initially, I barely wanted to do anything about it, but subscribers being what they are and demands, it's like, okay, fine. But this sort of leads me to a question for you, which was in a video I argued or made the point, is this not part of a strategy that Trump has tried before? This idea or concept of anchoring, right? You start with an extreme amount of, the Overton window, right? You try to normalize something by starting with a radical example. I use gay marriage as an example, but in the past, people are absolutely against gay marriage because it's radical. So you try and normalize it by allowing civil partnerships or civil unions. And this is the same with this anchoring idea, right? You start with this list of absolute crazy things Ukraine has to give up everything, because then they're more likely to come around to, okay, well, maybe we'll secede a little bit of territory if it means we definitely have security guarantees. Do you think that that's Trump's ploy here, or is that too intellectual for him?
I don't think it's too intellectual for him, because I don't think it's highly intellectual. It's a basic negotiation strategy, right? And Trump has done negotiation a lot, like on real estate deals and things like that. I actually think it's the problem, if that is his strategy, is anchoring might be a good strategy when it comes to a real estate deal where you're just trying to get money out of people and things like that. I don't think it works on something as significant as warfare. And even you use the other example of politics. I still don't think that applies, to warfare, where the points are clear, and they're clear for a reason. It could be part of his strategy. It still doesn't make sense to me, even if it is, because, that anchoring has happened a long time ago, and the plan has been rejected, and it keeps being brought up in the same exact way. It seems to me, if anything, if there's any method to this madness for why this is being brought up, for Trump personally, it's like a distraction from the political crises that he's facing back in the US right now, which have been huge. I mean, I don't know how much you guys follow American politics outside of the US, but obviously the Epstein stuff was really big right up before this peace plan was announced. And then, after the peace plan kind of hit the media, didn't hear a whole lot of people talking about the Epstein stuff anymore. A lot of media that had not even been covering the war in Ukraine was suddenly talking about Ukraine again. So that could be part of it. Whatever the method to the madness is, though, again, I'll just reiterate, it's not working. So it's time to try something different. Whatever the reasons are going on in the back rooms, and maybe I'm appealing to more sensible minds like Rubio here, but the strategy isn't working.
Well, if we have to call Rubio sensible, I mean, I guess relative he is, but what he's trying to do and get the US involved in Venezuela, I'm not sure. But okay, no, I hear you on a lot of that. But what about then this whole idea that Steve Witkoff, the envoy, obviously leaked or helped the Russians with how to approach Trump, right? Do you think there's truth to that? I mean, it's not particularly wild sort of presumption to make, I guess.
Yeah, like obviously with things like this, I always say, like, I don't know. I don't know what's going on in Witkoff's head. But, there's certainly a scenario where it's logical to see truth in that. There is a certain logic where maybe you could give him the benefit of the doubt and say he's just trying to get a deal done. But obviously, there's been a lot that has come out about Witkoff, and people speculate personal financial incentives and things like of that sort. And so what I would just say is, if those things are true, again, I have no way to confirm if those things are true or not. And it can get really hard in the media climate in the United States with issues like that to truly know what is truth and fact and what is just people being upset with the administration. It's hard to know, but if those things are true, it's obviously no reason at all for any country, whether it's Ukraine or Europe, to engage with this peace plan, because what's the point? They're obviously not looking out for Ukraine. They're looking out for their own best interests.
Yeah, but, along with everything, and I'm going to be devil's advocate again on this bit, there's a lot of emphasis on the untenability of Ukraine's resistance effort. But then we're constantly seeing things about Russia's imminent collapse. Well, where is it then? Why do people constantly say the Russian economy is about to collapse, much like the Russian bots or people say that Ukraine's front lines are about to collapse?
Yeah, when I see the narratives about Russia's economy imminently collapsing, typically that's something in a headline, but I don't see people arguing actually that Russia is going to collapse tomorrow. Rather, the information about Russia it's about trajectory. So Russia is on a trajectory towards ultimate collapse. I wouldn't say imminent, I would say ultimate, because when you are continuing to funnel limited resources into a war, ultimately, and you see, different symptoms of that showing up within the economy, whether that is high inflation, whether that is Russia selling off their gold, a lot of other signals, we could talk about that forever. Those point to an ultimate outcome, but not an imminent outcome. And so the question isn't, is Russia going to collapse tomorrow and we're all going to get out of this? The question is, does Ukraine have enough resistance left to continue to hold long enough for Russia to collapse. And one thing I've said for a long time is everybody thinks Ukraine is fighting a short war, but I've always maintained Ukraine is fighting a long war, and they have been since the very beginning, since the front lines kind of stabilized. I think Ukraine was very realistic about their goals here. In the media, there's always a temptation to want to overpromise, especially in headlines, to get people to click and say Russia's going to collapse imminently. But I don't think that's the case. But I do think ultimately it's coming, if that makes sense. And we can see that in the progression of Ukraine's abilities to do damage to the Russian economy. Those abilities are only increasing, while the symptoms of internal economic decay in Russia are only becoming more clear. And I would argue that Ukraine's ability to produce the weapons that it needs for its own defense to continue holding the lines, those are also increasing. So those are the factors we look at, but the timing isn't something that we try to predict.
No, that's fair. You remind me of another conversation I had with a guest, and he said it's sort of like a terminal illness, right? You don't know when that moment's going to come, but you're on that trajectory because it's to this ultimate, as you say, ultimate collapse instead of imminent, which I think is sort of quite a neat phrase distinction. But, you know, just to be, again, not to put water on the fire or whatever, but like a lot of Ukraine's ability to resist is dependent on continued Western support. Now, Europe has made it very clear their willingness to do so. America hasn't. And certain reports I've read today or headlines have demonstrated that there are rumors Trump wants to basically have the majority of the support off America by 27. You know, he's literally going to start putting assets out of Europe, not necessarily out of NATO completely. I'm not saying NATO is collapsing, but if America's not willing to prop up the eastern flank, right, where they have a significant amount of troop presence, that's a problem, isn't it, for Europe, because they have to balance their own interests or needs versus support to Ukraine. How do we, you know, how do you manage? I don't know. What do you think of that take? Right? I don't even know how to phrase it as a question. Like, what do we do?
There's a lot of pieces there. First, the thing we first need to do is understand with clarity the actual significance of American support for Ukraine. And the fact of the matter is, if America pulled every single thing away from Ukraine, in my opinion, while it's going to cause more losses for Ukraine and it's going to make things harder, it's not going to end their ability to fight their war. And with each passing day, that becomes more true. I mean, currently, the United States is not even providing, you know, significant weapons to Ukraine, except for what Europe purchases and then hands off to Ukraine. We're providing intelligence sharing, but, you know, this is one of those things that's really hard to analyze, because when it comes to intelligence sharing, it's not like people just put on a list exactly what's happening between the United States and other countries and what things other countries can handle that the United States is currently handling. We'll never know exactly, because that's the nature of intelligence. But one thing we do know is that the United States previously cut off intelligence sharing to Ukraine, and Ukraine didn't fold. And you know, the United States brought that intelligence sharing back. And so, you know, we realized two things. Actually, historically, all of the threats of the United States against Ukraine in terms of pulling everything back, those have been empty threats that have been used to try to force an outcome. But when push comes to shove, we haven't followed through on those threats. Not to say we couldn't, but also even when we did follow through for a short period of time, Ukraine continued to hold just fine. So that's the most significant piece. It's the intelligence sharing. When it comes to weapons, Ukraine is now domestically producing pretty much everything it actually needs. And again, that's increasing all the time. They're either producing it in factories in Ukraine, or they've contracted with factories in other European countries where, you know, Ukraine is just able to manufacture there because it's safer. Russia can't attack the facilities in those countries, or at least they don't seem willing to do that. And so all those pieces, you know, it doesn't scare me that much if the U.S. withdraws. If they do, it is not a problem of physics. It's a problem of narrative. So Europe has plenty of firepower for itself to contribute to the war effort in Ukraine, to help Ukraine get all the way to the finish line. The question is, will Europe do that, or will they be, you know, too afraid and consider their own defense? And that's why one of the things I talk about a lot is when I see Russian provocations against Europe, I don't see this as Russia imminently preparing for a war against NATO. I see it as Russia trying to control internal narratives within European countries so that they feel more inclined to keep back a larger portion of their military equipment rather than giving it to Ukraine. And it's just a narrative that we need to start working on now, not just a narrative for the sake of narrative. It's a true narrative that for Europe, defending Ukraine is the first step in their defense against Russia, because as long as Russia's fully occupied there, then they won't have the resources or the ability to continue to attack Europe. So yeah, scary things could happen, but I don't think it's the end of the world, even if the worst case scenario with the United States does come to.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, for me, I personally envisage a case where the US maybe dampens or reduces its offensive and defensive capabilities, as in they're there physically. But obviously, if the Europeans want to buy them from America, then Trump will be more than fine with that. But I think the US might be willing to continue logistical because recent NATO exercises, I believe, in Transylvania in Romania demonstrated like the French were the main leaders, I think. And it just showed quite starkly how lacking Europe is as a collective in terms of logistics, intelligence, and stuff. Do you think that that's something that could be the case, or would Trump just want to cut everything as much?
I think if Trump really wanted to cut everything, he would have done it, and he would have been done with it by now, right? I mean, we already cut off access to Ukraine within the Trump administration multiple times. It always came back. For whatever reason, a lot of people speculate about Trump's intentions. He wants to just side with Russia and get so many benefits. That could be true, but in my mind, if that's ultimately totally true, like why wouldn't Trump have just cut off aid to Ukraine and kept it cut off the first time? Especially because then the narrative within the United States was much more against Ukraine than it is today. As the Trump administration has progressed in office, far more Republicans, which by the way, I'm a Republican. I run in Republican circles typically, although I guess I identify more as a moderate these days. But
wow,
far more,
like that.
far more Republicans have, been willing to be critical of Trump's approach to Ukraine. And so he's got a lot less support internally for those types of things than he did at the beginning. And even at the beginning, when he had a lot of support, the majority of support, I believe, within the Republican Party to completely cut off Ukraine, he didn't do it. And so Trump is in a crisis in the United States right now of popularity. A lot of people, Republicans, are really upset about the Epstein files. It's not just a Democratic side of the fence. And so I don't know that he has the ability to maintain additional popularity crises on top of what he already has.
Yeah, he wants to go to war with Venezuela. Yeah, I mean, and just to be clear for audience members, I'm not laughing at Paul's political views. I mean, there is a big, obviously, change within the Republican Party. What was the moderate or traditional conservatism, like, I don't know, the Mitt Romneys or something, saying that's your choice, but like
the Reagan, yeah,
no, for sure.
It's completely.
No, but I guess sort of that makes me wonder then, what's your thoughts on these leaked communications? I believe it was Macron, Merz, some other people. I don't know if you've read about this. There was some leaked communications by European leaders effectively warning Zelensky about Trump, about Vance and everything, and shows you just how dead the transatlantic relationship, at least for the time being, is, right?
Yeah, I mean, they're just confirming, what all the analysts have been saying, and they're saying it out loud. I don't know if it's a big surprise. Yeah, it's hard to say. There's definitely a wedge between the United States and NATO and European countries, and it's getting driven wider. But I always also like to remind people that Trump only has, 3 years left in office. I don't think the American people are going to tolerate a third term, especially because his popularity continues to decrease. And so whatever happens right now, it's temporary, and eventually we will have somebody else in office.
Well, along for that day, question obviously wondering who that would be, but aside from that, also we've had these remarkable strikes by Ukraine in the Black Sea. Now the skeptics or pro-Putinists will say, well, the sinking of a couple of tankers doesn't change the overall trajectory of the war, but doesn't it demonstrate a core lacking in Russia's military architecture, which I think is pretty clear, but is right on top of the strikes into proper.
Yeah, it's no surprise. I mean, Russia lost control of the Black Sea early in the war. They had to relocate their naval fleet out of range of Ukraine because Ukraine just kept sinking them and they couldn't do anything about it. And so obviously Ukraine has always had the ability to sink Shadow Fleet tankers whenever they wanted to, or, maybe not sink, but just they could sink them. But right now they're disabling, not sinking them. They've always had the ability to do that. And so it's not really a question of military capability. It's rather a question of geopolitics and why Ukraine is willing to do this now. Ukraine is obviously taking the gloves off. And I think it's because, well, there's a lot of reasons. I could do very long videos on this, but long story short, the risks associated The geopolitical risks associated with Ukraine striking the Shadow Fleet are no longer looming as present because, first of all, some of those risks have already happened, and it seems like Ukraine can't do anything about it either way. And second of all, as I mentioned, Ukraine is also just less dependent on other countries for support at this point of the war than they were earlier on in the war. They can produce the core capabilities they need for themselves. And so now it's kind of an equation. It helps their strategy more to accelerate the destruction of the Russian economy by putting pressure on the Shadow Fleet than it would potentially hurt them by losing, major partners if major partners were upset by them doing that.
But Paul, I mean, just bluntly, do you not think you're being too optimistic about Ukraine? It can do all this, but Russia can't do anything. Like Russia has taken Pokrovsk effectively, right? Isn't that a big deal?
Not really. I mean, Russia took Bakhmut. The media focused on that for a long time. Russia lost hundreds of thousands of people. They finally took the city, and then it took them a long time to take Avdiivka. And then after they took Avdiivka, they've been sitting outside Pokrovsk for a long time. It took them a long time, and they haven't taken Pokrovsk, but the media has been telling us for months that they have. Eventually, they probably will, but that tells you something in and of itself. The media, rather than being too optimistic about Ukraine, what they do is they prophesy the loss of a Ukrainian city, and it actually takes like a month to years longer than the media thinks it will. And so, no, I don't think I'm being too optimistic. What happens if Russia takes Pokrovsk? From a practical level, of course, it's a loss, but Ukraine has many of their larger fortress cities behind that line. They've had many years to develop more layers. It's highly possible that Ukraine may just have decided to not put as many, soldiers and resources into the fight for Pokrovsk, so they experience less casualties because they want to trade land for time, because for them, the front line is not how they're going to end the war. The front line is just how they hold back Russia's advances for as long as possible. How Ukraine is going to win the war is the things in the rear, taking down the Russian economy, weakening the Putin regime in the minds of his people, all these things that we've talked about. And so when you understand where the actual war is taking place, the front line is where the combat is taking place, and I don't want to diminish the sacrifices that happened there. But where the actual war is taking place in terms of what is actually going to push things over the line to cause one side or the other to actually concede something, that's taking place, for example, with Shadow Fleet tankers, strikes on refineries, all those other sorts of things.
So you don't, just to clarify, so you don't agree with Douglas McGregor that because the Ukrainians have targeted the Black Sea and a couple of tankers, the Russians are now going to take Odessa in a couple of weeks? I think that's what he said. I'm being slightly facetious in my delivery, but that's what is he talking about?
I haven't seen those remarks, so I can't say one way or another, but if that's what he's saying, no, I don't agree.
Oh.
If Russia could take Odessa, they would have done it like forever ago.
No, 100%. Because personally, in my mind, I think that we covered this in our first conversation. But in my mind, I think the Russians are primarily after Novorossiya, to cut off southern and eastern Ukraine. It feels a lot of their strategic, ideological, and economic interests. But yeah, they can't. And all this rhetoric around that Russia is going to your point, try to do something against Europe. Right? Putin's remarks earlier in the week threatening Europe, which I made a video about this when they had the peace talks, right? Because it was quite revealing for two reasons. Firstly, the Chinese were in the room, and if people want a deeper dive as to why that matters, go and watch part one. But it's interesting that Wang Li, the foreign minister, was there. It doesn't have to be that they coincide on the same day. But two, Putin was clearly rattled because he doesn't come out of a press conference and then start very purposely targeting the group of countries that apparently have been irrelevant up until now. Europe, right? It's always been, I'll talk directly to the United States. Sod Ukraine, they're not important, and Europe is irrelevant. But the fact that he's now threatening Europe clearly shows he's getting irritated because they are willing to still be a spanner in the works of this Trump-Putin preferred outcome, right? Do you agree with that, or am I missing something?
Well, Putin's clearly rattled. I think even just psychologically, when you look at these tough guy personas, the more rattled they are, the more they lash out, the more they threaten. And threats aren't a show of strength, although they think they are because that's how their psychology and their personality works. But threats are more of a show of weakness. They're lashing out. They don't know what else to turn to. And so I think you're exactly right. Obviously, Putin is rattled. There's too many things going on for him not to be rattled. And if he's not rattled, then he's not being told what's going on or he's an idiot. Like, those are the three options.
Well, I think that them not being told, I think, is definitely part of it, right? We know that he hasn't been told military things. But I guess my last question for you, Paul, is, looking ahead, this is probably the time for last time we'll get together this year. So I wanted to give you a big thank you for joining the show, but also your awesome work and, seeing you grow and the same time and sort of giving me ideas and giving me some advice as well. After the first time we spoke, it's been a real pleasure. But my last question, I guess, is to sort of, as we go through the winter, what would you expect? What would you encourage people to focus on in the midst of this war and the sort of claims of a peace plan?
Yeah, I mean, I don't expect anything to come from the peace plan. So putting my money where my mouth is, I don't even really read the articles that come out about the peace plan anymore because it's a done deal. I'm looking for more interesting things. I don't find it very interesting. And so I would encourage people not to focus on that either. And in fact, the less that people focus on it, the less power it has, the less likely we are to see this stupid kind of media circus again in the future, if I can be blunt. The reason that this happens is because people engage with it. But, what could happen, I don't say I expect it to happen, but what could happen is we could see Flamingo missiles come into play more. Obviously, Ukraine has been stockpiling those. They're getting the targeting systems figured out. They're getting maps of Russia. We don't know when those are going to come into play, but they could come into play in a big way. And whether it's Flamingo missiles or something else, though, we'll just see progressive attacks by Ukraine continuing against Russia's energy infrastructure. Russia hasn't done anything meaningful to stop that, and so we'll see it continue, whether that's refineries, whether that's infrastructure in the Black Sea, maybe even infrastructure in St. Petersburg on the Baltic Sea, whether that's Shadow Fleet tankers, and that's going to just continue to do progressive decline to the Russian economy. Again, those results are not imminent, but they are ultimate.
Interesting. And you don't think anything like manpower or Ukraine's inability to access certain resources or equipment or something is going to be a factor as much?
I think Ukraine's manpower crisis has been vastly overstated because Ukraine has a huge pool of manpower that they could tap into and would tap into if they were absolutely desperate, and they haven't. Ukraine has a very high draft age. They could lower that draft age at any time to get a ton of manpower, at a time of their choosing. Obviously, those people would need to be trained, but the point is they haven't tapped into that yet. And so I think Ukraine is not struggling in terms of manpower as people think they are. Ukraine is producing more than enough drones and things of that sort domestically for its own purposes. Ukraine is continuing to get more support from European partners. Sweden just announced that they're, going to kind of stop supporting other things and consolidate support for Ukraine. And so that will probably continue. And so Ukraine will get more support from that, even if support from the United States diminishes, because honestly, support from the United States has already diminished. So it's not a factor at this point anyways.
Very definitive sign off there from Paul Warburg. For those of you watching, thanks for seeing part 2. You missed part 1, go and check it out. And we'll see you all next time, including with Paul, hopefully in the future. Good to see you all then. Take care.